Okay, so today we're going to move on with looking at the last of the four approaches that emerged in the wake of spatial science in the 1970s and 1980s. The different challengers to spatial science, as I said, you had challenges based on the lack of a human dimension from behavioral geography and humanistic geography. You had challenges on the political element or dimension of spatial science coming from radical geography and later on structuralist geographies such as Marxist geography, and the approach we're going to look at today, radical feminist geography. So this will be kind of a quick look at radical feminist geography. I'll also talk about the role of women in academic geography up to this point in time in the module, up to the 1970s, 1980s. As you probably have been aware, we haven't mentioned too many female geographers so far in the module. From this point on, you'll see more female geographers being mentioned. But definitely up to the 1970s, it's fair to say that academic geography, and indeed most academic subjects, were very much male dominated up to that point in time. But we'll talk about that in the next few slides anyway. So there's the key readings. I might need to just check. I think that's the chapter in the old book of Creswell. I think the new version of Creswell, probably the chapter might be different, but check that out anyway. And other readings there. So there's a good lot of readings on this topic. As I say, with all these lectures, I'm only really going to scratch the skin of the surface of this approach. There's a lot that can be said about feminist geographies. They're probably worth a couple of books in and of themselves, but the lecture is really just meant to be a pointer or a signpost to allow you to read more into this topic. So the first thing just to start with is just to note the position of women in academia up to the 1970s. So this will be the first thing we'll look at in this particular session today. Definitely things were not great for women in the mid 1900s, but things were even worse up to probably up to World War I. As the slide there says, in Britain and also in Ireland, a number of what were called the historic universities, even up to the early 1900s, were refusing to admit female students. So you have, say, the provost of Trinity College, George Salmon, saying in the early 1900s that over my dead body will women enter this college. I think a year later they did enter the college. I think he wasn't even dead at that stage, so I don't think I think he got overruled in that. And the board of Trinity around the same time saying, if a female had once passed the gate, it would be practically impossible to watch what buildings or what chambers she might enter, or how long she might remain there. Hashtag Kevin McAllister face in Home Alone. So yeah, there's definitely, you can definitely see that definitely in the early 1900s, it wasn't just a case that there was very few women involved in academic life, but in a number of cases, women were actively excluded from academic life. You might remember when we were talking about the geographical societies, we made the point that women weren't allowed to be fellows in the Royal Geographical Society, again up until the early 1900s. So this is a common strand or thread running through a lot of what is happening in academic life. It's not just geography, in academic life as a whole in the early 1900s, but also in society as a whole. The right to vote really doesn't get extended to women until the period around or just after World War I. For instance, the right to vote is exercised for the first time by women, or rather women over the age of 30, in the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom at the 1918 Westminster election. Now, things start to change. You start to see the first women being applied as lecturers and one or two as professors in universities across the UK and Ireland as you move into the 1930s and 1940s. But the number of women going to university slowly increases as the 1900s progress, and it's a slow increase. Obviously, I think things take off in a number of Western countries after World War II with the extension of the welfare state, which obviously allows scope for more female students to enter university. In Ireland, there's no, that doesn't happen really in Ireland. The big jump in Ireland probably comes after the late 1960s when you get the extension of free secondary education. Now, one of the points made by a lot of feminist geographers is to challenge the idea that there was no female involvement in geography during the period I'm talking about, the late 1800s, early 1900s. So a lot of what we talk about, if we're looking at the big stories or the big people or the big trends in academic geography, a lot of what we're usually talking about, with the notable exception of Ellen Churchill Semple, is we're looking at the work of male geographers. And in a lot of cases, nearly all the professors were male around this period of time, nearly all the lecturers were male. Where you do see women taking an active role in geographical work generally tends to be in what I'd like to say amateur or voluntary geographical work. So we talked about the explorations, and particularly the explorations in the 1800s, and how that work got brought back and highlighted as part of the work of the different geographical societies. Now, women also travelled in these expeditions, and there was a lot of geographical work done by these scholars, such as travel writings, for instance. But generally, and you'll even see this in Irish geography in the 1940s, generally this work did tend to get dismissed as not being academic, as it wasn't viewed as being scientific enough. So as Creswell writes in the first edition of his book, he says, there is no doubt that the travels of women in the 19th century and the early 20th century produced knowledge. It was just that the knowledge did not fit into the set of knowledge that was labelled geography at the time. As I said before as well, a few times, women were also barred up to 1913 from becoming fellows of the Royal Geographical Society. As Knight and Jeffrey suggests, this was based on male assumptions relating to the relationship between gender and scientific competence, and fairly crazy male assumptions at that. Now, it's interesting to note that when there was a vote on allowing women into the society, I think the vote passed by a 90-10 margin. So when the decision actually was made on it, generally the academics in the society more or less said, no, yeah, we should have women in the society. I think with a lot of these things, it's just a case that it was a case of more non-decision making than active decisions being made to keep it. It was, okay, women aren't a member of the society, maybe we should do something about it, but we'll do something about it later. And when something was actually done about it in terms of holding the vote, it basically very quickly became seen that it wasn't an issue at all. So women in geography in the early hundreds, there was very few women employed as lecturers or professors, as I said, but where you did see women becoming more active was in the voluntary dimension of geographical work, or the amateur dimension of geographical work. So women did play a significant role in the work of geographical societies in the early 1900s. And what's notable about the geographical societies, particularly the Geographical Society of Ireland, which I talked about a few lectures back, I'm sure you've all listened to that recorded lecture now. All these roles in these societies were on a voluntary basis. There were non-paid roles. Activism for these societies was done on a voluntary basis. So in cases where you had geographical work that was based on voluntary activity, women were very active in those cases. When it came to the paid academic, so-called scientific dimensions of geographical endeavour, these areas up until probably the 1960s, 1970s, and maybe even further in countries like Ireland, these positions were dominated by men, male geographers. One particularly significant person, again, as someone who was operating in a voluntary role, was Marion Newbigin, who was the editor of the Scottish Geographical magazine. That would have been it would be their version of Irish Geography, the journal or the magazine associated with the Scottish Geographical Society. So Marion Newbigin was the editor of this magazine or journal for well over 3 decades, and she was generally viewed as being an exceptional editor and someone who did have a big influence on other geographers, not including other male geographers, in terms of how she managed to get them involved in geographical work, geographical research, and give them a platform for their work. And a lot of people would see Marion Newbigin in some ways as being probably one of the most influential people in geography, not just in Britain, but she had an impact also in Irish geography, because people like T.W. Freeman, one of the pioneer geographers in Ireland, talks about her influence a lot. So she did have an influence on a lot of people who went on to be big names in geography. So a very significant person in her own right. But again, someone who doesn't get a lot of mention in the academic history books, the history of geography books. So this leads us to a question, and this is a big question that's put forward by feminist geographers. Is the problem with the history of geography, and we can see there is a problem with the history of geography in terms of female representation, in terms of the dominance up to very recent decades, the dominance of men in positions of power in academic departments of geography. But feminist geographers would say, is there a problem with the way the histories are written as well? Are histories written in such a way that you just focus on the big names in geography, they just focus on the people who were doing work in the academic departments, and the histories ignore other work where female geographers would have been more prominent? So why aren't we hearing about the work, the female travel writers? Why are we not hearing about the work done by women on a voluntary basis for the geographical societies? Why don't we hear more about Marion Newbigin, for instance? So that's a question to think about. Is the problem with the history of geography, or is it with the way that the history is written? I think it's fair to say that both elements have a very strong level of truth associated with them. What about women in Irish geography? There were very few full-time female lecturers employed in Irish geography departments up until the 1980s, 1990s. I'm thinking of the exceptions to the rule. You had Angrid Sims in the University College Dublin. You had Mary Cawley in University College Galway, who would have emerged, I think they would have started their careers probably in the 1970s. But definitely it is true to say that there was very few full-time women lecturers in Irish geography departments, probably up until the 1980s, or even the 1990s, it could be argued. Probably up to the 1990s, to be honest, guys, because there wasn't that many new people coming into Irish geography in the 1980s, as we discussed in that lecture a few classes back, which I'm sure you've all listened to, where women tended to be employed in geography departments. They generally tended to be employed in part-time roles and usually employed as demonstrators or tutors as opposed to full-time lecturers. So I know myself, in the case of Maynooth, I think you're all too young to have come across Sheila Waddington, but when I started my undergraduate studies in Maynooth in 1989, I mean a few years ago, back then, I'm trying to think who was in the department. There was 6 full-time lecturers, all male, so John Sweeney, Dennis Pringle, Paddy Duffy, Prunchie Spratnock, who did not mention yet, Jim Walsh, and the head of the department, William Smith or Seamus Smith, And the other member of the department was employed on a part-time basis, and that was Sheila Waddington, who was responsible for the second-year methodology classes, what you know today as GY301, GY302. Now, Sheila did eventually get promoted to full-time status later on in her career, but probably should have happened a lot earlier. So yeah, that was generally the scene in most Irish geography departments. I'd say up to the 1980s, probably really, I'll be honest, well up into the 1990s. Probably up to the emergence of the Celtic Tiger in the 1990s, which did allow for a big increase in employment for new lecturers. The second phase of big employment growth in geography departments after that phase had talked about the early 1970s. It's interesting to note that that phase of growth in the early 1970s, it was mainly Irish geographers, but it probably was also mainly male Irish geographers, Mary Cawley probably being one of the exceptions to the rule. So if you look at the departmental basis, and things in Ireland moved a lot slower than in other parts of the Western world. We're probably, I'll be honest, about 20 years after other places like the USA and Britain in this regard. If you looked at Ireland, probably up until the 1990s, there were definitely very few full-time women employed as lecturers in geography departments up to that point in time, and very few as professors. I think Angret Sims did become a head of the department, maybe even around this time. Mary Cawley did become the head of the department in Galway, maybe around this time or a bit later, but yeah, definitely, it's definitely fair to say that at the academic level, at the level of geography departments, Irish geography up until, let's be honest, probably the Celtic Tiger period was very much a male-dominated pursuit. However, again, as I said before, if you look at the voluntary dimension of geographical work, if you look at work done for the Geographical Society of Ireland, you get an entirely different picture. If you look at the membership, committee membership, so I don't know if you ever get a chance to look at the back issues of the Irish Geography Journal, but I flick through them occasionally just to have a look at who was on the members, who were the members of different committees at certain points of time. And what's interesting is the Geographical Society of Ireland, a lot of the committee, a number of the committee members are women. So when you look at leadership in the Geographical Society of Ireland, there's a strong, much stronger representation of women here. Now, what's interesting to note is generally the women members, committee members, generally tend to be the secretary or the treasurer. You have one or two women who do take the role of president of the society in the 40s and 50s. And then there's a big gap for a number of decades until the next female president of the society. I think Mary Cawley is probably the next one, maybe in the 1960s or 1970s. But if you look at the membership of the society, in 1944, the very first issue of Irish Geography, if you look at who was listed as members of the society, you'll see that there was 111 listed members and 63 of these were women. And some of these, as I said before, they held leading positions in the Geographical Society of Ireland. Some of these as well were very active in the society activities, the annual society field trips. And we talk again about the lack of representation of women in geography up until the 1960s, 1970s. But in the 1940s, if you look at the people who were writing articles in the first edition of Irish Geography, you have a fairly healthy representation of female geographers seen here, because, as I said again, a lot of these articles are based on the society's fieldwork activities, and you start to see more and more women. You see a number of women writing for Irish geography in the 1940s, and then all of a sudden, when you move into the 50s and 60s, that female dimension disappears when Irish geography probably becomes more scientific, or tries to become more scientific. So here's some of the work, the articles published or written by female geographers in Irish Geography. The very first ever article written in Irish Geography was a report on the Society's fieldwork activities in Virginia in County Cavan. the first edition in 1944. That was written by a female, G.E. Murphy. In the 40s and early 50s, you had articles by Olive Purcell on Old and New Kilcullen, and Jocelyn Otway Ruthven in the 1950 edition wrote an article on place names in Ireland. Okay, so that's the background context for what we're going to talk about in relation to feminist geography. First of all, I'll talk about feminist, quick word on feminism, very, very quick word on feminism and feminist theory. I'm not an expert, as you may have guessed, but I'm sure you've got a chance to listen to more expert people on this topic as you walk through your studies over the last few years. So what is feminism? As Creswell suggests, it's a grounded political and theoretical approach that starts from the observation that the world is systematically skewed against women. And the argument is that gender-based inequalities, gender-based oppressions show the need for a feminist perspective. As Nike and Jeffrey argue, feminism is a movement that seeks to promote women's liberty by dismantling unequal power relations between women and men. We can talk about different waves in the development of the feminist movement. We can talk about third wave feminism. The present day, some people talk about it as third wave feminism, others say it's fourth wave or fifth wave. Again, you don't need to get into that nitty-gritty for this module, folks, but if you're interested in the topic, definitely read into it. For this particular slide, I'm just going to focus mainly on first wave feminism and second wave feminism. Now, first wave feminism doesn't really have much of an impact on academic geography. This runs from around the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, and this focuses on the political rights of women, or the rights of women to own properties. The main focus really during this period is on the suffragette movement, the right to vote. So the efforts made to try to get women the right to vote, which a movement that lasted for decades, a number of decades, from the mid-1800s up to the early 1900s, until you reach a point in time around about the time of World War I or after World War I, where eventually the right to vote was extended to women in most Western countries. If you look at Britain and Ireland, 1918 Westminster election, the right to vote was extended to women aged 30 and over for the first time at that election. Second wave feminism, and this is the strand of feminism that impacts on radical feminist geography. This runs from the 1960s up until the early 1980s. It's a structuralist, there's strong structuralist elements here, so you can see, as it suggests there, just like the Marxist geographers, radical feminists are concerned with the manner in which society is structured. Now, the Marxist geographers were talking about how society was structured as a result of the impacts of capitalism, or global capitalism. Radical feminists are interested in other structures. They talk about the structure of patriarchy. So they're concerned about how society is structured by the impacts of the patriarchal system. The second wave of feminism also highlights a growing interest of women's position in the workplace, and within geography departments, a growing focus on the position of women in the academic geography workplace. So what is the role of women in academic geography, for instance? And then we have our third wave, and maybe fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh waves of feminism from the 1990s onwards. So what is feminist geography about, or radical feminist geography? There's two dimensions. Radical feminist geographers were focused on substantive research teams. So they were looking at topics that, to be honest, up to that point in time, were topics that hadn't really been looked at in academic geography before, because there's certain topics or issues that probably would have been overlooked by male geographers up to that point in time, but these would have been topics and issues that would have resonated with the relatively new or first-time female lecturers who were starting to emerge in most Western countries in the 70s and 80s. So substantive research teams such as the role of women in the workplace, the work done by women in the home, and so on. The other dimension was, with radical feminist geography, was to look at the history of geography itself, and to look at geography itself, how geography itself is organized. Recognizing, as we've seen already, that there is a gender bias in professional geography or academic geography. Now, professional geography, academic geography, we're talking about people working in geography departments, people employed on a full-time basis. Another key concern for the radical feminist geographers was the way that geography was done. They put forward the idea that certain ways of doing geography up to that point in time had been highlighted as better than others, and they generally viewed these ways of doing geography as being masculinist. So you start to see an idea being put forward by radical feminist geographers that certain techniques are masculinist and tend to be given too much prominence within the subject. So they talk about quantitative approaches as being more masculinist as opposed to qualitative approaches. They talk about the difference between hard data, which is facts and figures, and soft data, which is data you might gather using qualitative research techniques. So again, we've made this point already, we wouldn't just make it again. So as Creswell argues in the first edition of his book, he says, what counts as geography has itself been largely defined as men. And yes, as I said, we've seen this already. In most Western countries, the people who had positions of power in professional geography or academic geography up to that point in time were predominantly men. If you look at Ireland, you can move that dial another 2 decades later. You could say up to the 1990s in the Republic of Ireland, because a lot of times things happen a bit later in the Republic of Ireland than in other parts of the world. So a number of the leading feminist geographers, people like Gillian Rose, put forward the idea that one of the things that needs to be done as part of a feminist geography is the need to reconsider or reimagine the history of the discipline of geography. So, as she suggests, and as noted in Creswell, feminist geographers note that there's been a process that has systematically erased the presence of women from accounts of the history of geography. And we've gone through that point already, the idea that if you look at most histories of geography, you get this perception that really there's little or no female activity or involvement in geographical work up to that point in time. But if you look at what actually happened, you'll see that women were doing geographical work, but this work tends to be ignored or dismissed, maybe because it's not scientific enough, or maybe because it's work being done outside academic departments, it's work being done on a voluntary basis. So radical feminist geography emerges in the 70s and 1980s, and it's a structuralist approach. It's one of the structuralist geographies. Marxist geography is a member of this group or family of geographies. Radical feminist geography is the other major member of this group. So it talks about the structures associated with the patriarchy. The patriarchy which acts in such a way as to maintain male dominance over society. According to the radical feminist geographers, the patriarchy is seen to operate on many different levels. It's evident in the workplace, the home, and in terms of sexist attitudes or sexual harassment. The initial concern of the radical feminist geographers was initially focused on the position of women in the workplace. So a lot of the early research in terms of substantive themes in radical feminist geography generally focuses on studying the position of women in the workplace. There's also a focus on how women's work in the home was generally viewed as being undervalued and unrewarded, unpaid work. So radical feminist geography brought in new ideas into geography. For the first time ever, geographers were starting to talk about issues that were important to women, which in the male-dominated world of academic geography up to the 1970s, these were topics that weren't really discussed, that basically weren't viewed as being geographical. So this new approach brings in a new focus for geographical work, the importance of looking at the position of women in the workplace, in the home, and in society. The big focus of the radical strand in feminist geography, the radical feminist geographers of the 1970s and 1980s, was on structures, just like Marxist geography. The focus is on structures that act to cause things to happen in society. The structures that are of interest to radical feminist geography are not linked to capitalism, as would be the case with Marxist geography. They're linked to this concept of the patriarchy. So they're focusing on structures that reproduce gender equality, that cause gender equality to happen and help to maintain the status quo. So the patriarchy, as Creswell says, it's a system based on the ability of men to control and define women's roles in the economy, as well as how they are represented and defined in broadly cultural terms. So you start to see changes in relation to feminist geography as you move from the 1970s and 1980s onwards. As McDowell and Peake say in their 1990 book, they say there's been a shift in concerns from a concern solely with women to an analysis of the social relations between men and women. And there's been a greater emphasis on the social and spatial structures that create and reinforce women's oppression, and more recently, debates about the definition of patriarchy. And this is a new dimension you start to see coming in from the 90s onwards. The relationships between women's issues and other issues to do with class and race. So a growing debates about the interrelationship between class, race, and gender, and the welcome concern with issues of subjectivity and sexuality, as well as the economic basis of women's subordination. One of the leading groups in terms of helping to lead to the development of radical feminist geography and helping to create and support a critical mass of women geographers, particularly in Britain, was the Women and Geography Study Group, which emerged as a very influential group within British geography, starting from the early 1980s. As Nike and Jeffrey suggest, the emergence of this Women and Geography Study Group in the early 1980s in the United Kingdom was, for them, a key moment in the institutionalization of feminist geography. So this meant you now had a group where you could, people who had, women geographers could go to discuss matters. There was now a group where women geographers could discuss matters, they could share their research, they could support each other. Whereas prior to the 1980s, any women employed in academic geography departments probably felt, because there were so few of them, that they were largely isolated, and it was very hard for them to interact or interrelate with other women geographers. So two things were happening in the 1980s. There was more women being employed in geography departments, so you now were starting to see a potential for a critical mass of female geographers. But this Women and Geography Study Group provided the infrastructure, or the infrastructure that allowed women to work together to discuss matters in relation to geography. The initial focus of the group was on increasing the visibility of women within geography, both as the investigators of research, so increasing the visibility of women geographers themselves, but also as the subjects of research, so increasing the focus on research teams or research topics that would have a strong focus on women. So the work of women in the home, women's position in the workplace, and so on. So early research associated with the Women and Geography Study Group focused on forms of gender equality as they were played out in the home, as they were played out in the workplace, as they were played out in the city. It also focused on the role that women's segregation played in constraining their employment opportunities, but also their leisure opportunities. The key texts associated with this group, well, the 1984 text, Geography and Gender, An Introduction to Feminist Geography. This is probably the book that's the equivalent of Social Justice and the City for Master geographers. This is probably the book that really sparks the emergence of a distinct or defined radical feminist approach. And this is ultimately probably the Bible for radical feminist geographers in the 1980s. Later on, the group produces a book called Feminist Geographies, Exploration in Diversity and Difference. And that's an interesting book to look at because it highlights the changes in focus within feminist geography or feminist geographies as you move into the 1990s and 2000s, where you start to see a greater impact, sorry, a greater level of focus on how women's issues link up with other forms of oppression or other forms of marginalization in society, and how to link up with other big themes or big ideas. The Women and Geography Study Group is still in existence, but has now been renamed as the Gender and Feminist Geography Research Group. Now, a very, very quick slide or set of quick slides to look at where feminist geography went in the 1990s and 2000s. Feminist geographies have become, there's a lot more work being done in relation to feminist geographies in the 1990s and 2000s. It's very different in focus now to the work that was done in the 1980s. Definitely in the 1990s, you see a growing focus on geographies of difference. So looking at not just the role of women in society and in the workplace, not just looking at gender identities, but also seeing how gender identities can be shaped by other factors such as nationalism, racism, and imperialism. Creswell notes that contemporary modern feminist geographers have made notable contributions to a number of subdisciplines or areas within geography. So he talks about the contributions made to topics such as geographies of fear, feminist geographies of nature, feminist geographies of mobility, and feminist geographies of development. So yeah, I'll actually talk about this. This is probably the wrong number, but I will be getting you to do a few online comprehension exercises in the next few days. So this is one of the questions you may want to look at for one of these comprehension exercises. So the question there says, women and women's issues were largely invisible in academic geography for the period leading up to the 1970s. However, this all changed with the emergence of radical feminist geography. So offer a critical assessment of that statement. So yeah, it's a typical or atypical comprehension exercise. Again, look at the statement, tease it out, look back at what's been covered in the last 36 or 37 or 38 minutes of the lecture, and just tease out that statement. So are there arguments based on what you heard in the lecture? Can you make arguments in support of that statement? Based on what you've heard in the lecture, is there an argument or two arguments that you will make that you might say, actually, on that basis, I don't agree with this statement? So yes, what I want to see, if you want to do this question, I want a critical analysis of that statement. Don't just give me 3 arguments in favor of the statement. Try to give 2 or 3 arguments in favor of the statement, and try to see, is there at least one argument you can make where you don't fully agree with that statement. So yeah, the normal trend for these in-class exercises, these slides are a bit out of date, sorry. You can use your lecture notes. So yeah, this is an interesting point. Like, it's probably no harm to take, even though this is an online lecture, you can listen to it anytime you want. It's probably no harm to actually take notes while you're listening to this, because they will help you with online exercises such as this. But when you're answering the question, don't just copy down points off the slides, because that tells me, A, you don't understand the material, and B, you're not giving your own individual take on the issue. And like, if I want to read my own points off the lecture slides, I just go back and read over the slides myself. Now, it's an individual exercise. All these will be individual exercises, online ones. With some luck, when I get back in December, we might have a group exercise, scope for a group exercise in class. But this is an individual exercise, so do your own work, please. And any marks, as soon as I read your work, I'll mark it and get the mark back to you on Moodle as soon as possible. So yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a choice of questions based on the recorded lectures I've covered in this week, last week, and the week before. I know you had one based on spatial science. I'll probably give you one based on academic geography in Ireland. And what I want you to do is, I'll give you a choice of questions, and I'll probably ask you to do 2 of the questions. I'll give you a choice as to when you answer your first question and when you. But I'll work that out in the next few days. Anyway, that's the end of this lecture on radical feminist geography. Just over 40 minutes, so slightly shorter definitely a lot shorter than the one I covered in Marxist geography. But yeah, as I said, I'm really in this lecture and most of these lectures for these different approaches. I'm really just scratching the surface of the topic. There's a lot more you can learn about radical feminist geography or feminist geographies as a whole if you read if you engage with some of the recommended readings. So try to read Madrill if you can. It's a full book. If you don't think you have time to read a full book on feminist geography, then try to read a book, one of the chapters, try to read the relevant chapter of Creswell's book, or the relevant chapter of Nike and Jeffrey's book, or some of the other books on the list. Anyway, toodaloo.